and uncertainty, which is obviously what we hope you're going to get out of the session. And exactly as Michelle has said, we do know that change is a certainty. So just a quick introduction to me, first of all. I'm Helen Lawson. I run Wellbeing Training Solutions, where I deliver leadership skills, professional skills, people skills, and personal skills. So everything from dealing with stress and anxiety right the way through to how to
And what did she say afterwards, Mimi?
Oh, sorry. Could we just I should ask as well if everybody could put their mics on mute, please, while you're in the background, just so we don't have any noise in the room for everybody else. Thank you. Yes, so Wellbeing Training Solutions has been around for about 8 years now, dealing with those messages in the world. And it all comes from a position of having worked in business, in education, and in health, where it's obvious to me that the same things hold most of us back. That we are taught many things at school, but we're not taught two crucial things. The first thing is we're generally not taught how to learn. And the second thing is that we're not taught the general coping skills that we need in life. So that's what we hope to overcome a little bit today. So I'm really grateful to you for making the time to be here with us this afternoon. And my request to you would be something in you thought that this session was valuable enough for you to be here, and as a result what I'd really like to ask you to do is to try and turn off those external notifications. We know email is the biggest enemy of online training, so as you're here, be with us, be immersed in it, and get as much out of it as you possibly can. So, change and uncertainty are two things that are constant in our worlds and which also cause high levels of stress and anxiety for a lot of people. So, we'll take a look at what we might learn about them, and we'll make sure that we've got some time at the end for any questions. So, if you do have any questions, if I could ask you just to hold them, and we'll cover them at the end of the session. So let's start with what are we actually talking about? Well, what is change? And according to the dictionary, change is to make someone or something different, to alter or modify. And it's to replace something with someone else, especially something of the same kind that is newer or better, or substitute one thing for another. And I think those descriptions are really interesting because a lot of the time the change that we go through can be organisational change. And for many of us, we would go through that change thinking, well, actually, I'm not sure that this replacement, this new thing, is newer or better. I'm not sure that the old thing wasn't just good enough as it was. And we don't always want to make those changes. But there is one good thing about change, unlike uncertainty. At least with change, we know what's happening. So we should make that distinction first of all. Uncertainty means we don't know what's happening, and that's very destabilizing for us. With change, we do know what's happening. We might not like it, but we do know. And change might come as the result of some uncertainty. So if there's an organisational change or a life change, there might be a period of uncertainty first, and then we go into the change. But the problem we have with change is that it threatens us as a loss of control. And if we can't control things, we tend to get very, very uncomfortable. And as such, change can be a real stressor. And that can be a reaction to an event that we find uncomfortable. And why is it that we feel this way about change? Why are we not better at coping with change? And there might be some of you in the room who actually find you beating yourselves up now and again for not being better at coping with change. But actually, there are really good reasons why, as human beings, we find change hard. So, first of all, change is a certainty, but we fool ourselves that it's not, and we fool ourselves that we've got some sort of illusion of control. And eventually, when we find out that the world will change around us, whether we go along on board or not, that can become quite tricky. And change is a constant. We don't recognize it all the time because often the changes will come in a sort of drip effect. And when they come as a drip effect, we tend to be much better at being able to handle them and manage them. So, with change, there are two things that can really affect us. One is the intensity of the change, and the other is the duration of the change. So, if the change is very rapid, and that means that we have to face big changes very quickly, that will be a struggle. If the change isn't rapid, it could be, isn't big, but it could be over a much longer period of time, then we find the duration harder to cope with because it's almost like our ability to cope with change gets reduced by the extent of change that we're exposed to. And crucial to understanding why that is difficult for us as human beings is knowing and understanding the fact that our bodies and our brains were not were not created to deal with constant change or rapid change. Our bodies and brains were developed thousands and thousands of years ago. And at that time, we had two big things really that were a problem for us, which were the threats in our environment, which might be if we were out on the plains in the savannah, it might be the threat of an animal or it might be the threat of another human being. They'd be the two biggies. And then, of course, there would be the natural threats in terms of if we were getting our share of water that we needed and food that we needed. But essentially, what has happened now, after thousands of years of our world being very much the same, in the last few years, particularly in the last 150 years before that, our bodies and brains are still very much programmed, they're hardwired to find change a threat because change might threaten our very existence. And that threat comes hard to us. And unfortunately, we don't deal with change very well because we think that we are at risk. And so that means that we struggle. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because what I want everybody to go away with is a really clear sense that if you struggle with change, that isn't a weakness on your part. That is quite simply that your body and your brain is struggling with an environment that it never was built for. It wasn't built for an environment with social media where you work in organizations that go through restructures, transformational changes. Those things didn't exist. And so our bodies and our brains have been programmed to avoid threats and to seek rewards because threats are a danger. Inherently within us, hardwired, we see change as a threat, and therefore then is something we would want to avoid. Instead, we would seek rewards, which would be our comfort zone, staying where we feel that everything is okay, that it's safe. And that brings bigger problems with it because although we might think we love rewards, the truth is that hardwiredness again is that we feel the danger of a threat much more than we feel the rewards that come our way. And the reason for that is simple. Because the threats that we encounter, or certainly the threats that we encountered thousands of years ago, could be the end of us. It might threaten the end of our very existence. So we would rather react in too strong a way to 10 things, 9 of which were not a real threat, but one of which was a real threat, because then we survive, than we would respond to all things as if they might not be a real threat, and then our existence is threatened. Rewards, however, in terms of how our brain and our body processes them, are very different because we don't need rewards instantaneously, but we do need to respond to threats instantaneously. So threats hit us hard and fast and they linger longer, whereas rewards are a slower and less intense process. And we're much more predisposed to get more impact from threats to keep us alive, and that's why we struggle with them. So start with that knowledge that you are not unusual or different if you struggle with threats. Our other problem with change is that we don't naturally identify levels of threat easily. So our ancient ancestors would have been on the savannah, they would have heard a noise in the bushes, and they would have immediately assumed that that might be a predator or somebody from a neighbouring tribe who was a big threat to them. Now, for most of us, we are lucky enough to live in an environment where we don't have those sorts of threats. We aren't threatened for our existence on a daily basis. But that doesn't mean that we don't sense an email coming into our inbox as an enormous threat, because the hard wiring about threats needing to be a concern stays there. And so for some people, what happens is anything that is a threat gets interpreted as a major threat, something that could be the end of us. And then we therefore make everything a much bigger deal and we struggle even more with things like change. We need, therefore, to get better at recognizing, is this thing, this change that I'm concerned about, genuinely a risk to me? Or is it just something I'm scared of that might not present a risk? Or that there could be a way of looking at in a different and more positive way. And we'll talk a lot more about that later on as we go. So, to start with, that can be a really good question to ask yourself. This change, am I at risk? And what is the severity of that risk? Or am I just worried and therefore I'm not necessarily needing to put that threat response into place straight away? But we weren't built for the drip drip. And so if you're somebody who responds to even quite low level things, low level change or a change in an organization as a major threat, then the danger is you might feel that as a drip drip effect, that the duration of which becomes too much for you to bear. So they're all our issues with change, and it's useful to know the background to them to understand why you struggle. And what about uncertainty then? Well, uncertainty is defined as the state of being uncertain, no surprises there. And being uncertain is not able to be relied on, not known, or not definite. And all of that sounds really negative, doesn't it? There's a lot of not being able to relied on, not known, or not definite. And that suggests that if something can be relied on, it's great. And if something is known or definite, that's also great. But we're going to explore why that's not certainly the case and how sometimes uncertainty can get a bit of a bad rap when really uncertainty can present opportunities, but we might just not be looking at it properly. So our threat instincts, our fight or flight bits of us go into motion the second change or uncertainty is unleashed on us because we're worried that it threatens our survival. And so it's natural that we respond in a sometimes extreme way. But certainly with uncertainty, we all would love to have a crystal ball, and our loathing of uncertainty can cause us to fill voids with something rather than tolerate these limitless possibilities that we feel there are there instead. So this quote, I think, sums it up really quite nicely. Many people are unwilling to accept that precise knowledge of the future is simply not available. They would prefer to consult the charlatan who knows the answer and who will certainly have an explanation of why events turned out differently than they suggested they would, should that happen. So, as human beings, we demand certainty. We're desperate for it, but it's only an illusion. If we take, for example, weather forecasts, how many of you consult the weather forecast before you have a day out or before you arrange an event? But a weather forecast is no more than a probability that will mean something like on 40% of days with conditions like this, you might expect rain, which means on 60% of days like this, you might not. And yet we will still plan our worlds around it because our need for certainty is so great. So we plan around a vague possibility rather than accept we just don't know. And this need for certainty also fuels things like conspiracy theories. So if you come across somebody who has signed up to some conspiracy theories, or indeed if you do it for yourself, maybe you want to ask, why do I do that? Could it perhaps be that I believe the most inexplicable solution because I'm much happier to have that rather than have a void that says, I just don't know. We're not comfortable with that at all. We would rather believe that something is later wrong than be left with that void. And if you think about things that lots of people turn to at different times in their lives, tellers, tarot card readers, clairvoyants, they all give us answers where the absence of answers is too unsettling to us. And this is the extent to which we find uncertainty really tricky. However, uncertainty is not necessarily the negative it is often perceived as, and certainty can also be far from the ideal. But it's just we've got into this mindset that certainty is good, uncertainty is bad, change is bad, and staying the same is good. And if we consider what that really means, how can we really illustrate that? I think this is a good way to think about it. Certainty is not the same as security. The man who knows he will be executed tomorrow has certainty. But it's not a certainty that most of us would want. And so we kid ourselves that certainty is a wonderful thing when it can be a terrible thing. But the world is inherently uncertain, and to pretend otherwise is to create a risk. And that's a quote from the same person as the quote on the screen. It's from John Kay and Mervyn King. Mervyn King was the head of the Bank of England. So he was coming from a position of to pretend that a risk doesn't exist is to create a risk. And that's very real in financial terms. It's very real in all terms in our world. It's really difficult, though, to get people to recognize and appreciate that uncertainty comes with good things. And in fact, certainty can often feel stale or stuck or frustrating or boring. Let's think about the pandemic, which started as a period of uncertainty, but soon we went through these periods of uncertainty, action, stabilization, and then we'd start that period again. But when that certainty looked like you have to stay at home and you can't go and socialize with people, there wasn't much that people found rewarding about that. So we need to recognize that things are not as simple as we think they are, first off, very often. And we also need to not perpetuate the myth that uncertainty is necessarily a bad thing. It can be a really good thing. So our natural response to uncertainty then is that we want to avoid it. And uncertainty will often be linked with anxiety. So many people who struggle with anxiety struggle with coping with the fact that the world is uncertain. And one of the worst things we can do for anxiety is to avoid the very things that make us anxious. Let's imagine you experience social anxiety, so you're uncomfortable going into big crowds or speaking to new people. If you struggle in those environments, the tendency is, well, I want to withdraw from them then. I want to avoid those situations. But the more you withdraw and the more you avoid, the greater the anxiety grows. Instead of that, what's far better for us is for us to move into a situation where we expose ourselves to some element of uncertainty, some element of anxiety, and then we can grow our comfort zone. Because ultimately we like to predict outcomes, to evaluate, to plan and prepare, but that is not always possible. And for the person who is fixated on doing those things, uncertainty creates a real problem because they aren't predicting outcomes, evaluating, planning and preparing for one thing. Their uncertain future might be four different things. And then they have to predict the outcomes, evaluate, plan and prepare for all of those things. And that's extraordinarily draining. But ambiguity is a stressor and it is time and energy wasted. Sometimes it's just much safer to acknowledge, I don't know what I don't know, and let's deal with that reality rather than wasting all our time and energy trying to predict something that we can't. Because otherwise, we've got to imagine options and then we've got to imagine all the options for those options. And before you know it, you've driven yourself slightly mad trying to think about every possibility that could come to you. A really valuable example of how much we do not deal well with uncertainty is to think about particular conditions which might result in terminal diagnoses. So, for example, there is a condition called Huntington's disease, which can affect families. It is unfortunately hereditary. And there has been research done in such situations that explores the possibilities for people within those families. So parents might have children carrying the gene, and then while everybody in the family might carry the gene, some will go on to develop the disease and some people won't. And there is a test that can be done now to help people to determine whether they will go on to develop the disease. And what they found through their extensive research is that for lots of people, they say, I don't want to know. I don't want to know the outcome because I don't want to know the worst. But actually, when they've looked at that research very carefully, what they have found is that the people who do find out whether they're going to go on to develop this disease, even if they find out that they are going to develop it, they have lower levels of depression and better well-being than the people who don't find out. And that is put down very much to the fact that our inability and discomfort with uncertainty has a much more negative effect on our well-being than the knowledge of the truth, even if the truth is not what we'd want it to be. And we anticipate using our threat response. And our threat response is quite simply the fight or flight mechanism, which has now been added to by the flock or the freeze or the fawn, which can also happen. So our ancient ancestors, again, they hear that loud noise in the bushes, and as a response, their bodies prepare to fight it or to flee from it. And that brings all our attention very narrowly onto two things: fight or flee. And that threat response is really difficult for us because when we have that threat response, we lose reason and proportion, and our bodies become focused on tunnel vision to get us through this immediate danger, even though the risk from that immediate danger might not be as significant as we have initially anticipated that it is. And so our threat response causes us more and more problems as well. And this all sounds very negative. It sounds like you're constantly fighting your biology, which to an extent you are. But when these things happen, if you can bring in your logical brain rather than your instinctive responses, if you can respond rather than react, you will find that developing the skills to get through uncertainty and change becomes much easier. I'm going to look at a slide now, which I apologise if anybody in the room has been to any of my previous sessions. If you have, you've probably seen this slide. And although I apologise, it's not a really sincere apology, only from the point of view that I include this slide time and time again, because I think even if you've seen it before, the value of it so far outweighs the risk of boring you with seeing it again. And what this image is showing you is that in life, we work in three circles. We have our inner circle of control, the little green circle in the middle. And that is the stuff that we have direct control over. That is me. It is my actions, my reactions, and that's it. I have control over nothing else. So when we think about change and uncertainty, it's really helpful to recognize, what can I control here? Start there. What can I control? And I can control my actions and my reactions. So I do lots of training with lots of corporate organizations all across the world. And one thing that you often see is that people who are threatened with transformation, with changes within their organisation, will sometimes start to behave in uncharacteristic ways. They become more snappy, more agitated, less amenable, more sarcastic. And when all that happens, they also become emotionally less stable, and then they get more tired, they're more drained, and as a result, their performance is affected. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is if you are an employer and you're looking to make changes within your organisation and you see somebody responding in this way, your attitude towards them is going to change in terms of their value to your organisation. So if we were instead to think, right, what can I control? My actions, my reactions, and focus on those and of giving the very best account of ourselves, we put ourselves in so much a stronger position in the world. But unfortunately, because we get transfixed with the things we can't do anything about, that sometimes let the stuff we can control disappear out of our grasp and give us a worse time. We've then got the slightly larger circle, which is our circle of influence. So I can't control my boss, I can't control the organisational change, I can't control the people who work for me, or my family, or my friends, but I can influence them. And very topically at the moment, I can't change at this moment in time what's happening politically, but I do have influence over who's going to be in politically after the next election if I choose to vote. These are all ways in which we have influence over the world, if not control. So control is us, it's all of us. Influence is I'll do what I can do to influence this situation to give the best possible outcome. And then the outside circle is our circle of concern. And that's the area where we just have to accept it. We have to say, okay, this organisational change is happening. I really don't like it, but I can't do anything about it, but I can bring my attention back to where I can influence things and where I can control things. And that's the same if you're dealing with your children or a partner or finances, that there is real empowerment in just acknowledging what you can do, what you can influence, and then accepting the rest, so all of your efforts get brought back to the control and the influence that you do have that can make a real difference for you. And in times of change, where we are obviously dealing with flux and uncertainty, where we feel there will be some flux, the value in this is that even in a fast paced environment where things are moving quickly, if you apply this one tool to help you recognize your control and your influence, you can get strategic much more quickly and go into problem solving mode rather than feeling overwhelmed by it all. Because as soon as you set an action in place, you will generally feel much better. So, what else can you do to cultivate your control and remembering that that control is only over yourself? Well, the first thing you can do is to have an open mind. Have an open mind about the fact that maybe the change that's coming could be good for you, even if on first presentation it isn't. It could be. And the uncertainty also, if you're open minded to it, could have some benefits for you. And we'll talk much more about what that might be like. In order to believe that, though, you probably have to have a belief in a growth mindset. You have to believe that when things don't go right, you can get learning out of it, rather than thinking that when things don't go right, that's a personal failing on me. And if you can adjust your mindset from the fixed mindset of you can't teach an old dog new tricks, it's too late for me, I am what I am, this is where I'll be forever, into the growth mindset of actually the world is full of opportunities and possibilities. And even if I get things wrong, I can learn things that I take forward with me into the future. That's a much more empowering way to approach the world and approach change and uncertainty. And that's about being adaptable, which is being able and willing to change. But even better than that is going one step further, which is being flexible. And that's about being willing to be adaptable and then doing it easily. And if you adopt the growth mindset, you can change adaptability into flexibility, because the more you are able and willing to change, even if you're reluctant at first, the more flexible you'll become, in as much as you get to a point that you're willing and able to do it easily. So it's all about expanding these comfort zones, trying new things, recognizing that being open will make you more willing to make mistakes from which you can learn, rather than from which you identify yourself as having failed. And whether that's in a job situation or personal experiences, that's really empowering. And in all of that, we build our resilience, because if we accept that we will make mistakes and we might fail, in inverted commas, but that actually all of those things lead us to greater resilience because we've learned something from it, which we take forward to a new experience, even better. And then finally, on this one about cultivating your control, there is something in there about having some positivity. Now, I'm really cautious whenever I talk about these things that when I talk positivity, I do not mean toxic positivity, which is where you feel the need to pretend to the rest of the world that everything is okay all the time, because everything is not okay for anybody all the time. We all have peaks and troughs. But if we can take a more positive approach to change, to uncertainty, recognizing that there might be opportunities in it, then what we find is that instead of pretending that everything is okay, we're going through a process of evolving. And that evolution allows us to take on board new challenges and do new things. And sometimes those things will be things that we think, that's not where I want to be and it's not what I want to do. And other times they will open doors that we couldn't have imagined. And so positivity just gives you an added part of that mindset and an open mind that takes you towards challenges rather than repels you from them, and therefore makes them more scary and makes you want to avoid them in the future. And with all of that said and done, we have to also acknowledge that there is a stress trap when we're looking at change and uncertainty. Both of them can be stressors. And by stressors, I mean events that cause us to have a stressful response. And we must acknowledge that. We can't pretend that every change and every period of uncertainty is something you can embrace with open arms and say, well, yes, it will all be wonderful, because that would be as naive as saying it will all be terrible. It's natural for you to find them stressful. But stress isn't always a bad thing. Let's imagine, for example, that you are going through a change, whether that be at home or at work, and that change creates a stress in you, but that stress motivates you in an exam, for example, or to deliver a presentation. And the stress, which implements that fight or flight mechanism, gives you the tunnel vision, puts all the energy in your body to where it should be, and convinces you and enables you to do your very best for a period of time until you get the outcome that you need. That can be enormously positive type of stress. And in fact, some people thrive on an element of stress. And I would ask you to think just for a moment, you're not going to have to do any feedback to me or to anybody else, but I would like you to think for just one moment of one occasion where stress has proven positive for you. It could have been the stress of an interview. It could have been the stress of giving birth. It could have been the stress of managing a project or delivering a presentation or having to get something done by a deadline that you didn't think you were capable of. All of those things are normally encountered as stresses, and we consider them as negative because we would rather we didn't have to go through them. But in terms of what it drives us to achieve and enables us to do, they actually can be really positive. Again, not suggesting for 1 minute that we start to suggest that all stress is positive, because sometimes too much stress is just too much. But if we can find a positive, a real one that we believe in, it can be helpful. And equally, if anybody in the virtual room here is considering trying to eliminate all stress from their lives, my first tip to you would be don't do that, because it's just impossible. And we actually have a generation of people now, well, more than a generation. We have many people in our world who have some sort of expectation that we shouldn't have to experience stress. And that's just not real life. We have to go through stresses. We can't feel the ups without the downs. The difficulties are always there. So rather than trying to eliminate the stresses, if we can try and embrace them where they're helpful and manage them where they're not, and this ties in with a lot of the work that Michelle's team does around people managing their stress buckets and making sure that they manage the level of the threats that they're experiencing and the stress, and that they've got good coping mechanisms, then it can be so much more helpful. And if you are somebody who struggles with stress, who struggles with these things, just consider for a moment the opportunities that might be available in any given situation that bring you stress. If that's change, if that's uncertainty, could it be that at the end of this change or uncertainty, what you actually end up with is something that was better than what you started with? And I'll give you a really simple example. I've been running this business for 8 years, but prior to that, I was always employed. And I just found myself in positions that really didn't work for me for personal reasons. My dad was not well. I didn't get the flexibility I needed to be there for him, and I needed to make a change. And my decision was, if I go to another employer, I'll find the same problems all over again. And that was all extremely stressful. And so I decided I would set up my own business, because I had to get out of where I was so that I could go to what I needed my life to look like. Really stressful. But I recognize that in that there are opportunities. And if the worst happened and my plan didn't work out, well, I'll find another plan. I will find something else. And for many people, this is something that stops them looking for another job, is this idea of, well, what if that doesn't work out? But what if it does? And sometimes we need to ask ourselves, not what if it goes wrong, but what if it goes right? So there can always be opportunities in change and uncertainty. And we just need to be very mindful of our ability to monitor and manage our response to these stresses. So first of all, be conscious of the stresses that are hitting you. What are they? What stresses are arriving at your door that are maybe having a physical impact if you're not even conscious of them? What are the things that make us feel like our stress bucket is overwhelmed, is overflowing, and we can no longer cope anymore? And then what mechanisms do we need to put in place to respond effectively to that? Whether that's asking somebody for help, or whether it's about maybe saying, actually, I can't take on any more of that from somebody else. And that might be in a period of change to just say, I just need a moment to consolidate, give me that, and then we can move on. And when we think about change and uncertainty, it's useful to think about it perhaps in this way. In front of us, we've got the pressure performance curve. And if we think of Pressure as another word for stress. And you'll see that along the bottom axis, along the x-axis, we've got pressure, and it starts off low and then it gets much higher in the middle, and then at the end we've got very high pressure. And the performance on the y-axis starts low and it goes very high. So if you have very, very low levels of pressure, and when I say this, I'm always aware that the people in the room are thinking, I really wish I had really low levels of pressure. This is a place I'd love to be in the world right now. Low levels of pressure, and that I could also get away with low levels of performance, where you're in the bored out situation at the very beginning of that graph. And most of us, even if not now, have experienced that at some stage or another. Maybe when we've just started a job and nobody gives us enough to do, or thinking back to when we did work experience and we're just waiting for that next piece of activity to come our way. Low levels of pressure, low levels of performance, and therefore we are bored and we don't feel good about it. That is not a good place to be. But then as we move across the curve, what you can see is we move more towards moderate levels of pressure. And with that moderate levels of pressure comes increasingly better performance. And that's in the ideal zone. That ideal zone is where we feel really quite comfortable about things, but we're working at a good level, and it makes us feel motivated, it makes us feel inspired, and it makes us feel like we're really achieving something. And then if we go one step further, we go through to the stretch zone, which is the optimal performance. And that, I've noted your hand up, James. If it's okay, if we could just, I'll finish the graph and then I'll come to you and we'll hear your question or comment at that point. Thank you. In the stretch zone, we go a little bit further. So we take ourselves out of our comfort zone and we go into an area that's not entirely comfortable. And I've talked about this, alluded to this already. And when we do that, we build our confidence. Okay, so I'm not comfortable. I've moved into a stretch. Some people now inadvertently or mistakenly call this imposter syndrome. Being in the stretch zone is not the same as imposter syndrome. When we stretch ourselves, we're growing. That's where we want to be. And that's where our optimal performance is. But we have to be able to gravitate backwards between the ideal zone and the optimal zone because we need a rest from the stretch and we need to get back to comfort. And then we'll see that we can tip over and the performance starts to drop off when we go into the strain zone. In other words, we've gone from stretch to it's too much. And finally, we go into the burnout zone where it's actually so much pressure that our performance is now dreadful. And when we get past the optimal performance, we're in what we'd call the zone of delusion. And the zone of delusion is where we convince ourselves if I do a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, then with all of that, I'll perform better. But we don't, because we can only ever give so much of ourselves. So when looking at change and uncertainty, remember that the stress that you experience and the pressure that you experience can be helpful if they're contained within these parameters and they can enhance your performance. But if they go too far, then they need some exploration. James.
So I just wanted to ask about pressure and performance.
Yep.
Is that your perceived pressure and performance, or is it someone else's? Are you looking at it from someone else's perspective?
That's a really
these curves will look different for different people.
They absolutely would. So it's all about your personal interpretation of this. So for all of you, you would have exactly as you've said, a slightly different looking curve. And for some people, their comfort zone will be much smaller and much lower. And that might be for people who haven't ever really done enough stretch. So we'll often find that people new into the workforce will find the stretch zone particularly challenging and their comfort zone will be quite narrow because they just haven't had the experience yet. And other times it might be people who've been in this particular situation for a very long time, but they failed to challenge themselves and move into stretch, and therefore their comfort zone always stays small. But if we just push ourselves a little bit, we tend to find that it gets much better. Is that okay, James?
That's fine, thank you.
Yeah, so very unique. Thank you for asking. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful that you can think for yourselves and for other people. Can I put myself in this position? Where would I plot myself right now? If I were to plot myself on this graph, where would I be? And what does that mean about the level of stress that I'm encountering? And that might be related to change or anxiety, or it might be something different. We're now going to think about serendipity. And you might think that I've lost my mind, but I think that serendipity is a fantastic way to help us cope with change and uncertainty. So, further to all these other ways of coping better with change and uncertainty and the tools and techniques that we've talked about, serendipity is a different way of looking at the world. And sometimes we miss things out about the opportunities that are there. So normally when I ask people what is serendipity, they will say things like it's luck, or they'll use a dictionary definition which might even focus on luck. But increasingly there are many people, one of the main proponents of this is somebody called Dr. Christian Bush from the London School of Economics. And he wrote a book called The Serendipity Mindset, which personally I love. It might be something you want to look at. And he calls that book The Art of Creating Good Luck. And that's about recognizing that there is more to luck than what is created and thrown at you. It's easier sometimes to recognize serendipity in practice, however, than it is to maybe define it with a dictionary definition. And that's why I've got a dog on the slide, because dogs are brilliant at serendipity. I'm a sad dog lady, and so I would love to use a dog wherever I can. And for the rest of you, if any of you have ever known a dog or you've got a dog, you will be well aware that normally if there is food in the room, that dog will be well aware of where that food is, even if the food isn't intended for them. And they will use everything they've got, the sad eyes, the begging motion, the looking desperately sad in the corner, to get you to share what you've got with them. This is a situation where the dog isn't necessarily waiting for the food to drop, but instead what they're thinking about is how can I make that food drop in my direction. They know there's always a chance and they're ready for action at any time to take advantage of that. And for me, while it might seem quite a flippant analogy, I think it's a great expression of how we can use serendipity in our lives. When we're going through things like change and uncertainty and everything might seem like doom or gloom, or just that we are uncomfortable, instead of asking ourselves or telling ourselves all the potentially dreadful outcomes, we could start to be a bit more serendipitous like this dog and think, okay, but what might fall out of this that could be good for me? What might be useful? What can I do now to capitalize on that? So again, just a mention of that fixed or growth mindset. You have to have a growth mindset to encounter the serendipity mindset. And the growth mindset on this slide is about saying, I'm always substantially able to change how intelligent I am. Because when you believe that, you know that whatever difficulties you encounter, you will find a way through it, over it, or around it. Whereas if at the top of the slide we believe instead that our intelligence is something very basic about us, that we can't change very much, we don't have the belief that we can move out of these difficult situations. We think we are where we are. That's a great expression everybody's using in business at the moment. We are where we are. It is what it is. But no, we are where we are right now, but we don't have to be there tomorrow. And it is what it is right now, but we don't have to accept that forever. We can accept instead that we can change how intelligent. And intelligence is nothing more than the acquisition of knowledge and skills and the application of those things. And so we can change our outcomes. So the serendipity mindset, as we drill down into it a bit more deeply, is about there being an unplanned moment in your life. Something happens, it could be the change or the uncertainty, out of which there is some unexpected good luck. And with that good luck, you make a proactive decision. And with that, there can come some positive outcomes. So if we take this out of the world of work for a moment and put it instead in our personal lives, an example I would give you is that myself and my husband, 24 years ago, had been looking for the right house for a couple of years, hadn't been able to find anything. And ultimately, we looked and we looked and we went to all the estate agents and nothing was giving anything. And one day we drove past a house and it had a sold sign outside. And we thought, well, that's just typical, isn't it? We'd love something like that, but it's gone. So it was an unplanned moment. We didn't go out looking for a house. It was an unplanned moment. And I made a proactive decision to decide to call the estate agents who had got the sold sign up and ask them, did they have anything else that was there? Similar, something in the area or a similar type of property, to which they responded that they'd just taken on a booking from 3 doors up the road and it just hadn't gone on the market formally yet. So we had an unplanned moment. We had some unexpected good luck with some proactive decisions in it, which led to positive outcomes. 24 years later, we're still in the same house. And if most of us think about occasions in our lives, whether it is getting a job because somebody told you a job was available and you then made the proactive decision to apply, or getting a new project, or getting a promotion, or finding a partner, so many of those things which we think are luck are not luck. But until we recognize it, we miss all the opportunities for luck. So I now tend to say, not that I'm lucky. I used to always say I felt I was a very lucky person. But now I understand the serendipity mindset. What I think I am is a fortunate person. And a fortunate person is somewhat different because there is proactivity in there that makes it happen. If somebody bought you a lottery ticket, you did nothing except the ticket won, that's lucky. If, however, you bring things into play, if you're like that dog that makes things happen, then that is serendipity. And once you recognize the opportunities, you can make it happen so much more readily. And serendipity really matters. Around 30 to 50% of major scientific breakthroughs happen by accident. So, for example, medications, there are so many medications that we now have because somebody found that a medication they created for one thing had another impact and they were able to use it for that. I work in smoking cessation a lot. There is a medication in smoking cessation where that's exactly the case. It was used for mental health conditions. They found people spontaneously stop smoking. And there is perhaps the most famous example of Alexander Fleming back in 1928 researching bacterium. And in one of his petri dishes that contained bacteria, it was left uncovered on a windowsill overnight. And the blue-green mold that was growing in the dish the following morning had a space around it. And he became curious and he connected the dots and he discovered penicillin. It was unplanned, there was some good luck, but crucially, he didn't ignore it. He was curious and proactive. And the result wasn't just positive for him, it was positive for all of us as a result. It is about preparation meeting opportunity. In other words, I am prepared that if I see something that might warrant my attention, I will take the opportunity. I will look further at it. It's about coincidence, yes, sometimes. It's about human ambition and a bit of imagination. How might that and that join up together to be to my benefit? And plans are really important. Many of us, particularly any really smart people in the room, we think we can think our way out of anything. And actually, plans are great, they're a great tool. But if we're never prepared for the unplanned, what are we missing? So take a moment to rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 10, how good at you are deviating from the plans and instead thinking about there might be some serendipity here, there might be an opportunity I haven't looked at. Consider, are you a pessimist, a realist, or an optimist? Or best of all, a realistic optimist, someone who is realistic about the fact that generally speaking in life, good things happen, but they're much more likely to happen if you put your all into them as well. And if you're bought into any of this, if any of this idea of starting to recognize opportunities, which we're talking about because often opportunities come from change and uncertainty, these are some ways you can foster a serendipitous mindset. Is first of all to recognize it's not just coincidence or luck. It is far more than that. If you have no part in it, it's luck or coincidence. If you play your part, it's serendipity. It's about spotting and connecting those dots. It's about building bridges and identifying gaps and working how to get from where I am to where I want to be and utilizing those bridges within there. We've talked about uncertainty and change and how they foster in us feelings of fear and scarcity and isolation, feeling alone, feeling like we can't do things. But if instead of feeling just uncertain and that change are fear, scarcity, and isolation based, we start to consider that perhaps uncertainty and change might lead us to serendipity, then we tend to approach the world with curiosity. We consider opportunities and we make connections with people and between things. And that is a world of smart luck. That's the difference between being a passive agent, a passive recipient, of what the world throws at you, or an active agent in the world you choose to create. So review your serendipity success and do it regularly. Ask yourself, have there been any episodes of serendipity? Keep it recent, just in the last 6 months. Or have there been occasions where maybe there were opportunities and I missed them because I didn't recognize the serendipity that could be there? What could you have done differently for yourself or for others if you'd been more open-minded, if you understood serendipity and how it could work for you? And these are things for you to go away and consider some more. And what you can do now in terms of that is regularly review those serendipity experiences and record the learning. Don't lose the learning. If we don't record it, we tend to do something called post-rationalization. And that is where things that might seem a bit unusual, instead of saying, yes, that was serendipity, we'll go, oh, well, it wasn't really serendipity. It was just luck, or it was just this. Make it what it really was. Acknowledge your part in it so you can make it happen again. Be open-minded, be curious, and keep your radar firmly on. And then just think for yourself, how might a serendipity mindset change your approach to change and uncertainty? You're here because something in the title about embracing change and uncertainty triggered your interest. And if it did, then presumably there's something that you might find a bit difficult about change and uncertainty. And perhaps you can use some of the tools that we talked about earlier in the presentation, or perhaps you just focus on serendipity and start to consciously look for it and when it has existed in your life, and consider what a difference it might take moving forward and how empowering and positive that might feel. And just in summary, acknowledge that discomfort with change and uncertainty is completely normal. Be kind to yourself because you are having to fight your nature, but that will get so much easier the more you do it. The more you do it, the less you avoid it, the better you get at it. You'll create those new neural pathways. Build your slow and objective thinking where instead of reacting to things, you respond to things. It's more considered, a slower process. Focus on what you can control and what you can influence, not on what is outside your control, because that is a complete waste of your energy. Embrace the benefits of a growth mindset, acknowledging that if you think you can't, you'll probably be right. And if you think you can, you will also probably be right. And seize serendipity wherever you find it. Have a go, see what happens. Ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen? And that is the end of my session for you on change and uncertainty and embracing them. And my contact details there if anybody would like to get in touch. And aside from that, we've got a few minutes left and I'm really, really happy to take any questions from anybody that would like to ask them. Feel free to unmute and have a chat, or you can pop them in the chat if you would rather.
Oh, thank you so much, Helen. That was really interesting and insightful. We don't often get the opportunity to reflect for ourselves. I think that's nice just to have that opportunity while we're listening to you this afternoon to reflect on how those things apply to us. I'm going to stop the recording now. So if you do want to ask questions, the questions themselves won't be recorded. But before I do that, just to say there is a feedback link in the chat. So if you have got 5 minutes, we really appreciate your feedback from the session. It helps us to shape our future sessions. So I'll stop the recording now. Just again, thank you again, everyone, this afternoon for attending and giving up your time today, and thank you to Helen for a great talk.
Very welcome, and please do, I'm happy